August 23, 1973. Stockholm, Sweden. At first, it seemed like any other morning at the Kreditbanken branch in Norrmalmstorg Square. The day was clear, the city moved at its usual pace, and inside the bank, customers were going about their business without a second thought. Just after 10 a.m., a man walked through the front doors wearing a wig, sunglasses, and holding a machine gun. He opened fire, spraying bullets into the ceiling. People screamed. Others dropped to the floor. And then came the words that marked the beginning of what would become one of the most psychologically complex robberies in history. The party has just begun. The man was Jan-Erik Olsson, a 32-year-old career criminal who had recently escaped from prison while on furlough. But this wasn't a crime of impulse. Olsson came prepared, with weapons, a plan, and demands. Within minutes, he had taken 4 bank employees hostage, 3 women and 1 man, and barricaded himself inside. Outside, the square flooded with police, reporters, and curious onlookers. Snipers were positioned on rooftops. Negotiators arrived. The entire city was watching. But what no one realized, not yet, was that this robbery would go far beyond stolen money or a dramatic standoff. What unfolded over the next 6 days would introduce the world to a term that didn't even exist yet: Stockholm Syndrome. And it started right here. The scene outside the bank had turned into a media frenzy. Cameras rolled. Police secured the perimeter. Inside, Jan-Erik Olsson wasn't just holding hostages, he was orchestrating a spectacle. But Olsson didn't want the money in the drawers. His demands were far more specific. He requested the release of his friend, Clark Olofsson, a notorious bank robber who was already behind bars. He also wanted a getaway car and millions in Swedish kronor. Surprisingly, the Swedish government agreed. Within hours, Olofsson was flown to the scene and brought inside the bank, supposedly to help defuse the situation. But instead of acting as a mediator, he joined Olsson and became part of the hostage-taker team. What followed was a tense 6-day standoff. But as the hours dragged on, something strange began to happen. Inside the vault, the lines between captor and captive began to blur. The hostages weren't just complying out of fear. They were talking to Olsson. They were laughing with him. They were, in some unspoken way, connecting with him. At one point, one of the women was allowed to make a phone call. She told the Prime Minister of Sweden in her own voice, "I'm not afraid of these men. I'm afraid the police will attack and we'll all die." It was an alarming shift. And it was only just beginning. By day 2, the Kreditbanken branch had become the stage for a psychological drama no one saw coming. The 4 hostages, Kristen, Elizabeth, Brigitta, and Sven, were being held in the bank's vault, a space just large enough for all of them to sit, sleep, and breathe in the stale air. It was dark, cramped. The hours passed slowly. And yet, something unexpected was happening behind the steel door. Despite the fear and uncertainty, the hostages began forming emotional bonds with their captors. Olsson spoke calmly with them. He gave one his jacket when she was cold. He let another walk around the vault to stretch her legs. He joked. He reassured them. He showed them that, at least in his own mind, he wasn't the villain. Even Clark Olofsson, who had supposedly been brought in to help end the crisis, became a strange figure of comfort to the hostages. They didn't see him as a threat. They saw him as a protector, someone who might actually keep them safe. And outside, the authorities were watching the clock. The pressure to act was rising. But every time they tried to push in, the response from inside was the same. "Don't. We'll all die if you do." The standoff wasn't just about tactics anymore. It had become an emotional tug-of-war. And the hostages were no longer just victims. They were becoming participants in their own captivity. As the standoff stretched into its 4th day, the situation inside the vault grew more surreal. The police, now under enormous pressure from the public and media, tried everything: negotiations, time delays, even psychological experts. But the response from inside the bank remained consistent. No force, no raid, or someone would die. And then came another twist. One of the hostages called the Prime Minister, again. This time, she didn't just express fear. She defended the gunman. She told the Prime Minister that Olsson had been kind to them, that he hadn't harmed anyone, and that she trusted him more than the police. That call made headlines. The media picked it up. Psychologists began speculating on what was happening. The term didn't exist yet, but Stockholm Syndrome was being born, right there in real time. The hostages weren't brainwashed. They weren't coerced. They were reacting to a terrifying, impossible situation in the only way their minds knew how, by forming bonds of survival. What the world saw as irrational, to them, made perfect sense. And outside, the clock kept ticking. Sweden had never seen anything like this before. And behind those walls, something far more complex than a robbery was unfolding. By the sixth day, tension inside the bank had reached a breaking point. The vault had become suffocating. The hostages were exhausted. And yet, they still showed no fear toward Olsson or Olofsson. If anything, their loyalty seemed to grow stronger with each passing hour. Outside, police officials had run out of patience. They decided it was time to act. On the morning of August 28th, they drilled holes into the vault ceiling and pumped in tear gas. There was no gunfire. No one was injured. But just like that, the standoff was over. Olsson surrendered. So did Olofsson. And the hostages? They walked out, but they didn't run. They didn't cry out in relief. They hugged their captors. Some even whispered words of comfort to them as they were led away in handcuffs. To the outside world, it was hard to process. How could victims show compassion to the very people who had held them at gunpoint? But inside that vault, something deeper had happened, something even the hostages themselves couldn't fully explain. A new psychological phenomenon had just been named. And soon, it would spread far beyond Stockholm. In the weeks that followed, the world struggled to make sense of what had happened inside Kreditbanken. The hostages were examined by doctors, questioned by police, interviewed by the media. And yet, none of them spoke with hatred toward their captors. They didn't want revenge. In fact, some of them defended Olsson and Olofsson publicly. One of the women even visited Olofsson in prison after the ordeal. Psychologists had no clear framework for this behavior. But soon a term was coined: Stockholm Syndrome, a survival-driven psychological response in which hostages form emotional connections with their captors. It wasn't about logic. It wasn't about sympathy. It was about trauma, fear, and the instinct to humanize someone in order to stay alive. The case became a subject of study in universities, law enforcement training, even counterterrorism programs. And the phrase, Stockholm Syndrome, would soon become part of everyday language, used far beyond the world of crime. As for the people involved, Jan-Erik Olsson was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Clark Olofsson, despite his role, was eventually released and continued to make headlines in the years that followed. The hostages went on with their lives, forever changed, but never truly broken. And the bank? It reopened. But it never forgot. The vault was sealed. The trauma studied. And the world learned something new, not about crime, but about the fragility of the human mind when placed under impossible pressure. Because sometimes, the most unbelievable part of a heist isn't how it begins. It's how it ends.